Dear colleagues and friends, Raim Shayegan bestowed upon me the honor and the pleasure to introduce to you my dear friend Josef Wiesehoffer. Actually, I think Josef Wiesehoffer doesn't have to be introduced in that circle anyhow, but nevertheless, I will try to do my best. So, to approach such a kind of introduction, you can do it in many different ways. Of course, you can just have a look at his impressive curriculum vitae and the stations of his scientific career. So he received his PhD at the University of Münster with an extraordinary work on Darius coming to the throne and the monument and inscription of Bisitun, a work and a book which became a standard publication in the decades to come. He received his habilitation at the University of Heidelberg, moving his interest chronologically towards the Hellenistic times, but nevertheless still focusing on the history of Iran. So a work on the Frataraka, a Hellenistic dynasty of Fars, dealing especially not only with literary sources, but also with epigraphic and especially numismatic sources, so a broad range of sources to rewrite and deal with historical problems related to the larger Iran. His further career then brought him to the Fernuniversität Hagen, where he stayed for some years and where he developed a special interest also in social history. A social history writing about childhood in antiquity, writing about orphany in antiquity, writing about motherhood in antiquity, so a very broad range of interest. And finally, he came to that place which was very much related to his scientific work, that is the University of Kiel. Josef Wiesehoffer shaped the ancient history in Kiel, but especially in Germany, due to his special understanding of what ancient history is and what it is about. It is not only about Greek and Roman history, but it has a large, broader conception, let's say a conception which not only includes what we would call the Middle East, but also Iran, of course, and reaching as far as Central Asia. So his reputation in the many publications, about more than 10 books, more than 230 articles, is tremendous. He is really a masterpiece of an international scholar, and this becomes evident if you look at not only at handbooks dealing with the history of Iran through the ages, but on all kinds of encyclopedia which have been written and published, I would say, in the last 30 years. So these are the major steps, so to say, in a shortcut version, but there is also the human being, Josef Wiesehoffer. Josef is an extraordinary man, not an extraordinary scholar, but he is really a very, very special person. And although he is a great scholar, his life is not only devoted to scholarship, and I think this makes him even more special. The center of his life is, of course, his family, his dear wife Ursula, but also his 3 children. So this, I think, is a very, very essential part of his life. But he has a broad range of interest. I think a very special one is his fascination for soccer, for football. So he is a devotee of the FC Köln, I have to say. Of course, this means also some suffering and pain, because it was in 1978 for the last time that FC Köln won the German championship. So, but nevertheless, but there is hope, Josef, because the FC Köln was just promoted for the first division just some weeks ago, so things will become well again. Let's hope so, He likes movies, of course. He enjoys movies, but they have to have a happy end, If they do not have a happy end, he doesn't like them very much, and this might be the reason that he does not really fall in love with French movies. Also, his wife, Ursula, is a French teacher, and we tried a lot, you know, to boost his interest in French movies as well. It was not very successful at all. So he likes movies, of course, you know. He has an interest also in music, also in popular and in rock music, especially the 70s are important for him, I think. So I think you see there's a whole range of fascinating interest. But, of course, this is also somehow interrelated with his scientific interests. And I would say to characterize this relationship, one has to focus on a scholar's, and in this way of Josef's, private library. This is a very special place. So I do not know who has ever been at his house, at his home, and moved at the basement, or let's say was moving through the pillars of books which are stapled there. One can see the broad interests of Josef Wiesehoffer. These broad interests are not only related to the world of antiquity. You know, it ranges really until a very present time. And I would even say Josef Wiesehoffer could also be a contemporary historian due to his expertise in that very field. I know very well that his dear wife Ursula is also somehow suffering by that kind of passion for books, and this is a never-ending story. You know, all different rooms of the house are becoming storage rooms of books. But Ursula, I have to apologize to say this. You have married a scholar, you know, and a scholar who loves in books. But I also have to apologize to Josef that I have to reveal a secret to Ursula as well, that sometimes he is really smuggling in the books in the house so that he is still enlarging his library. So you see this combination between his erudition, his scholarship, and his private atmosphere. But such an introduction would not be a real introduction without really, let's say, trying at least to characterize some specific of his scientific approach and some specifics of how he deals with history and how he approaches history. There is, on the one side, as maybe all of you know, his broad chronological framework. This broad chronological framework is somehow also testified by this conference where we have moving, let's say, through the history of Iran from the Achaemenids through Seleucid times, Parthian times, and Sasanian times. And all of you know there is a high specialization already in these different fields. But Josef is one of the rare scholars who really is a master in all these fields. So he is not specialized in one of these epochs. He has been dealing with all of them. So he has a very, very broad interest. And this very broad interest became evident very early in his work. And it is combined with a special methodology and a special, let's say, treatment of sources. Although all historians, let's say, are somehow bound to dealing with grand narratives, but Josef Wiesehoffer is also a special case of dealing with the sources, dealing with the intention of sources, dealing with the history of the sources themselves, dealing with the problems related to these sources. And this takes us to another field, I think, which is of great importance, which I already mentioned. It is this larger perspective of ancient history. Many of you know that it is quite rare in ancient history or in classics to move beyond the history of Greeks and Romans. But Josef Wiesehoffer was doing this all the time, all through his career. And he was really propagating this ideal that an ancient historian has to be able to deal with antiquity as a whole, as a holistic entity, moving beyond a Eurocentric or even Greco-centric perspective. I think this is a very important aspect. And he has motivated generations of young scholars by personal contact, by personal communication, or by supervising PhDs in following up this exciting way of scientific exploration. On the other side, there's another aspect, and I think this is also of great importance, Josef Wiesehoffer was always interested in the importance of reception history. So what has been done with historical narratives? What has been done with historical sources through the ages? How have master narratives been developed? How have they been conceptualized? And what are the ideological basics of these sources? So we see a really great scholar, I would say an international scholar, exhibiting a breadth of knowledge and of approach, which is really absolutely extraordinary. So please welcome Josef Wiesehoffer for his keynote. Please, Josef.
Robert, what have we agreed on? $500 or $600? So it's so wonderful to have good old friends, and Robert is one of my dearest and oldest friends. When we first met in Innsbruck, beneath the Golden Dachel, I had written a review of his diploma thesis, and when was it? I'm not quite sure. In 1990 something. Early 90s and so on, and from that moment onwards we are in close contact with each other, and you see it's still lingering on. But I have to thank other people too, especially the organizers of the conference, particularly Alexa Sekira from the Getty Research Institute, and my dear friend Rahim Shayegan from the Purdavut Center of UCLA for having invited me to this very inspiring and thought-provoking conference on the nexus between ancient Iran and the West. I have learned so much in these 2 days and listened to so many excellent talks that it is all the more a real challenge for me to give the keynote lecture today. I hope not to disappoint you too much, especially not after these extremely nice words of introduction by Robert. But the situation in Mesopotamia became still more alarming and inspired a more genuine fear in all, not merely the people in Rome, but the rest of mankind as well. For Artaxerxes, a Persian, after conquering the Parthians in 3 battles and killing their king, Artabanus, made a campaign against Hatra in the endeavor to capture it as a base for attacking the Romans. He accordingly became a source of fear to us, for he was encamped with a large army so as to threaten not only Mesopotamia, but also Syria, and he boasted that he would win back everything that the ancient Persians had once held, as far as the Grecian Sea, claiming that all this was his rightful inheritance from his forefathers. The change of power that took place in the areas beyond the Euphrates, which the Roman senator Cassius Dio characterizes in this quotation as a radical change also for the Romans, has so often been analyzed and commented on already, one could assume that revisiting the topic is nothing more than carrying coals to Newcastle. One can hardly study those topics more thoroughly than Erich Kettenhofen, Philipp Heuse, Matthew Canepa, Touraj Daryaei, and especially our dear host Rahim Shayegan in his incredibly instructive book, Arsacids and Sasanians, Political Ideology in Post-Hellenistic and Late Antique Persia. I would therefore like to take a different approach today which I owe not least to Robert, who luckily is here today. This approach is related to a theory he developed together with Michael Gehler about the characteristics of an empire when viewed as an epoch-spanning phenomenon. Since not everyone present here took part in the empire conferences organized by the two in Hildesheim, Vienna and Blankenheim, allow me to briefly name these characteristics in a first step. First, empires develop usually without intentional planning. Second, in the case of empires that stand out for their size, spatial ties are fundamentally expansive and flexible, and borders are dynamic, fluid, and permeable. Ideologically, this idea is often associated with a trans-territorial claim to power that can in theory encompass the entire world. This idea was pointed at in many of the talks of our conference. Third, the use of military force is an essential means of power for empires, but so is the tolerance of religious diversity within and the integration of heterogeneous ethnic and/or cultural groups. Multi-ethnicity and territorial, religious, as well as cultural diversity are equally characteristics of an empire. How successfully an empire copes with these challenges is often enough the decisive factor for its durability. Fourth, although empires can develop independently of forms of rule and government, they usually have a strong political center and continuous support from a class of ruling elites who are involved in the rule and communicate with the center of power at different levels, directly and indirectly. These elites can also be used to mobilize the military and economic resources of the empire, for example, in the fight against internal and external enemies. Fifth, competing empires are often enough ignored or presented as inferior in terms of civilizational excellence. Sixth, also decisive for the success of imperial rule is the formation of imperial structures in the form of a bureaucracy that facilitates administrative procedures, tax collection, and service in warfare, and thus guarantees security and prosperity for the subjects. Seventh, the idea that a ruler has a duty of care towards the ruled, combined with an in part divinely sanctioned sense of mission, leads us to the field of ideology, which is essential for the legitimation and safeguarding of domination, both internally and externally. And eighth, empires strive to develop a powerful culture of reception to remind contemporaries and posterity of their achievements. But at the same time, they themselves are subject to the imagination of others, both from contemporaries and from posterity. For a long time, empire research focused primarily on the center of power and examined how it succeeded or at some point failed to guarantee the stability of the internal and external power structures. In this context, the relations between center and periphery within and outside an empire played a role. Three areas were and are especially important in this respect. First, the creation of imperial structures and the implementation of imperial values throughout the empire and beyond. Second, imbalances in power and development between the imperial center and the internal peripheries and the tensions resulting from them. And finally, the successful mobilization of provincial elites and their integration into the imperial structures. Too seldom, however, the focus of attention has been shifted onto the peripheries instead of the center, to consider what happened there and why, what role the elites of the peripheries played in large empires or in their vicinity, and why and under what circumstances those elites developed their own ideas and possibly even brought down empires and replaced them with their own ones. We may think in that respect of the Medes and the Neo-Babylonians during the fall of the Assyrian Empire, of the Persians under Cyrus, or of the Macedonians in the 4th century BC. It goes without saying that such an approach also raises the question of historical continuities and ruptures anew. In this lecture, I will try to use this approach for reflections on the transition from Arsacid to Sassanid rule in the Near East, and at the same time include the relevant source material in those reflections. I hope that I can show A, what conditions made this change of rule possible, B, what the agenda of the early Sasanians might have been, C, how and why the early Sassanid rule can be described both as a continuation of their predecessors' rule and as a step in a new direction, and D, why historical research into this change of rule to this day speaks of a rupture rather than of continuity. As already emphasized, the continuous support of a class of ruling elites is constitutive for an empire. This includes elites located in the internal periphery as well as those at home in the extra-imperial peripheries. Research has always dwelt on the latter in particular. It is not least in the context of the discussion on secondary state formation that the emergence and development of new elites in the periphery of empires with their developed stratified social systems have been examined. Recently, though, the one-dimensionality of this model has been pointed out with increasing frequency, and it has been argued that there are other possible factors that could be at work here, such as economic, ecological, or intra-societal influences. At the center of research were and still are the formation and shaping of these elites of the periphery, and increasingly also their agendas, not least when initiatives were launched from their ranks to end or supersede the rule of a neighboring empire. But, as this conference has shown, the elites of the inner imperial peripheries also attract increasing interest. This is evidenced by a growing number of treatises not only about the historical geography and the specific historical, religious, and cultural traditions in the areas they controlled, but also about the relationship of these vessels to their overlord. These treatises cover a wide array of topics. Some focus on the occasions when the elites of the center and those of the periphery meet, and the local elites have the opportunity to familiarize themselves with the political and social patterns of action and representation of and in the center. Others focus on the interplay between local autonomy on the one hand and supervision and control by the center on the other. Another field of research studies the possibilities of the elites of the periphery to ascend to the highest ranks in the areas of politics, the economy, and/or the military, for example, by being elevated to the court ranks, or by marrying into the royal family, or by being privileged in some other way. Further important subjects of study in this context are the possibilities of local elites to profit from trans-regional economic and political connections facilitated by the formation of large empires, and the chances to integrate themselves into these new supra-regional networks by orienting themselves towards the concepts of rulers and rule and forms of representation that characterize the center. Also included here are the possibilities of the peripheral elites to extend their influence to neighboring areas outside the empire. The last, but by no means least interesting topic I want to mention here is the question of how satisfied or dissatisfied the elites of the periphery were with their role in the empire as a whole. The answer to that question can be deduced from the concrete policies of these elites and from their tendency to either imitate or oppose their overlords and to develop their own political agendas. Whether internal peripheries become new centers depends on many factors. For one thing, there is the question of whether the interests of the periphery are adequately represented at the respective center. Even if they are not, there have to be groups in the periphery that not only develop a political agenda, but are also able to represent it internally as well as externally. And it has to be an agenda that both catches on locally and is appealing on the imperial level. And finally, there is the question as to whether the military and political power potential gained through cooperation and conflict, first in the periphery and later at the imperial level, is sufficient for an imperial new beginning. Against this backdrop, let us now take a look at the rise of the Sasanians. Before doing so, however, we must not forget that the tradition on the early Sassanids' rise to power is extremely problematic. The historiographical testimonies are, where contemporary, not of an indigenous, local nature, and where of an indigenous nature, not contemporary. Indeed, they are often enough linguistically or even culturally broken. Of vital importance, since they are of a contemporary as well as local nature, are the archaeological and epigraphic testimonies. But even they are not without pitfalls, as is proven by the figure of Sasan and by the difficulties in interpreting historical terms such as Middle Persian Niyagan, ancestors, or Ahinagon, forebears. Still, I think two things are relatively clear. First, the rise of the Sasanids, beginning with the rebellion of Babak, to which the era of 205-6 may refer, and the victory of Ardashir I over Artabanas IV on April the 28th, 224, in the plain of Hormuzjan, are part of a greater historical context of domestic conflicts among the Arsacids, as well as the wars between Parthians and Romans. It was these conflicts that enabled Babak and his sons Shapur and Ardashir to systematically expand their political and military influence in Fars. Second, the victory of Ardashir was not a commando enterprise, but succeeded thanks to the previous recognition of Sassanid rule in Fars and the support of allies from Fars, but probably also from other parts of southwestern Iran. Thus, Ardashir obviously had both exceptional military and political leadership qualities. Even if the details remain unclear due to the fact that the tradition only became detailed in the late Sassanid period, one thing seems clear. Until his victory on the battlefield in 224 and his presumed coronation in 226 AD, the new strongman had to endure numerous military conflicts in order to consolidate his rule. And I may also say many diplomatic contacts. The anchoring of Sassanid rule in Fars, which had already taken place at this time, is reflected in the way in which, despite all the models from the late Parthian period, Ardashir was able to give his rule its own urban, palatial, ideological, and iconographic face. The decisive action he took against the Romans and the last remnants of Arsacid rule also testify to the firmness of the Sasanian political, military, and social base in Fars. Let's take a closer look at these connections. From the very beginning, the early Sasanians obviously placed themselves in a tradition that was closely connected to their homeland Fars. This is most evident in four areas. First, in the minting of coins, which takes over or resumes elements of the regional post-Achaemenid coinage, as you can see here. Second, in the graffiti from Persepolis, which in their way of depicting members of the regional elites proclaim the transition from the dynasties of Persis to the Sasanians. Third, in the preference of the new rulers for holy sites, such as Persepolis or Nakshi Rustam, where they immortalized themselves in words and images. Fourth, as Rahim has perfectly shown, in the influence of formulas and concepts of oral literature, some of them already known from Achaemenid times, on the early Sasanians' royal inscriptions. And finally, in the development of new, and here I quote Matthew, ideational land and cityscapes. Matthew, who has studied them particularly thoroughly, aptly characterized them as follows, and I quote him: Ardashir I and Shapur I not only fashioned a new vision of the past, but innovated an urbanistic and architectural repertoire that inspired the activities of their successors. The founders of the dynasty used these techniques to reconstitute and reanimate the awe-inspiring, yet half-understood monumental patrimony of Pars, weaving together old and new sites, rituals, and images, as well as creating vital new sites of memory, such as Ardashir, Hwara, and Bishapur. End of quote. Even though this was by no means a conscious emulation of the Achaemenids, we will come to the reasons why later on, the clear reference to Fars's memorial landscape is nevertheless unmistakable. Conversely, there are hardly any indications of special Arsacid references to Fars. The absence of expressly Parthian material findings in Fars can easily be explained by general phenomena of indirect rule of imperial centers in internal peripheries. If anything, it is often enough evidence of a successful policy to secure imperial cohesion. However, it is notable that nothing is known of any special privileged treatment of the dynasts of Fars by the Arsacids, unlike in the case of the rulers of Adiabene or Elymais, for example. In addition, as Marek Olbrecht has shown, Arsacid claims to Achaemenid descendants were only sporadic, despite the more favorable conditions for tradition. In view of the granting of the royal title and the coin privilege to the sub-Parthian rulers of Fars, it can hardly be assumed that the Arsacids neglected Fars because the Phrataraka had supported the Seleucid ruler Demetrius II in 140 BC, for example. On the contrary, despite the problematic statements in the Chronicle of Arbela, which report fierce wars between Parthians and Persians, it can be assumed that Fars, not least because of the tranquility there, was not in the focus of Arsacid interest, unlike Susiane, Elymais, Cherakini, or the territories in northern Mesopotamia. Not least the classical sources, but also, for example, the inscription on the Heracles statue from Seleucia and Palmyrene caravan inscriptions speak of direct or indirect interventions by the center in connection with Roman campaigns in the east or with Parthian economic policy. This is not the case as far as Fars is concerned. Here you find some parts of Shapur's inscription from Naqshi Rustam from the Kaaba i Zardusht, the so-called Res Gestae Divi Saporis, and I'm not inclined to read it out loudly, but I'm coming back to certain parts of this inscription. Very early on, the Sasanids developed the idea of their own dynasty, and this in a way that was clearly anti-Arsacid, in my view, first only on a regional and then on an imperial level. This served, among other things, quite obviously their own legitimation. They refer, for example, to an ancestor of their own, Sasan, who, in contrast to Arsaces, is likely to be a mythical figure. They place themselves in the area of the Anahita sanctuary in Istachar. And, as already emphasized, they keep the memory of their ancestors and forebears, that is, the ancestors of the family and the regional predecessors in rule, in holy places. Similar to the Achaemenids, they establish religious and economic foundations for the salvation of their own souls and those of the living and dead members of the dynasty. You can find references to these institutions in the Shapur inscription. Initially, they reject the Arsacid era's chronology by inventing their own, which begins in 205-6 AD and is also related to the beginnings of rule in regional contexts, similar to Seleucid and Parthian chronology. But later on, they rather used the Seleucid era and a calculation according to regnal years. Furthermore, they created something like a court of their own, and this is also mentioned here in this inscription of Shapur. He mentions the court of his father Ardashir. A court which was to experience clear expansions in the course of time. Shapur's court is much bigger, larger than the court of his father Ardashir. And as the Narseh inscription from Paikuli shows, they created a ritual for determining the ruler, which provided for a right of acclamation for the Persian Parthian aristocracy. The archaeological findings, as Pier Francesco Cagliari recently showed, also document the fact that the Sasanians intended their own rule to stand for a new beginning. For the construction of his first fire temple, the Tahti Nishin in Ardashir Khwara, as well as for the famous investiture relief Naqshi Rustam I, Ardashir obviously fell back on the competence of artisans from the Roman Empire, maybe not iconographically, but technically and organizationally. And that, after he had already relied on Elamaic competence and aid for the much less elaborated reliefs at Firuzabad and Naqshi Rajab. Ardashir's coin legends and images also show this intentional change. There, Ardashir gradually develops from Bai Ardashir Shah and Puz Bai Pabak Shah, who carries the upright tiara of Mithridates II, which had, however, already distinguished Ardashir's predecessors in the regional rule over Fars, to Mazdesen by Ardashir Shah Iran with his own royal fire on the reverse, and finally to Mazdesen by Shahanshah Iran Kichihras Yazdan. In the end, he thus bore a title that made the difference between him and the Arsacid Basileus Basileon Arsaces Euergetes Dikaios Epiphanes Philhellen clearly visible. Furthermore, the Sasanians obviously developed their own idea of how they intended to organize the empire as a whole early on. They were aware of the precariousness of a rule that was ethnically and culturally concentrated solely on Fars. So in order to get broad and continuous support from the ruling elites experienced in the imperial service, and to be able to use them to mobilize the military and economic resources of the empire, the Sasanians not only fell back on the competences and means of power of the Persian nobles, but also on those of the members of the Parthian clans who were willing to cooperate with them. That is why, again and again, the inscriptions mention Persians and Parthians, on whom the kings intended to lean. And at court, too, members of the Parthian clans of the Karin, Suren, or Mihran appeared already quite early. As far as administration and economy are concerned, we can only gradually observe fundamental changes in relation to the Parthian period, even if it appears as if the foundation of cities on royal land and the settlement of craftsmen in them, not least of deported craftsmen and artisans, was expedited at an early stage for reasons of increasing and stabilizing tax revenues and facilitating administrative processes. The final formation of the concept of Iran and its counterpart An-Iran, as well as their religious and cultural charge, Iran being under divine protection, An-Iran being a place of idols, may also be due to the fact that the regional rule over Fars was now to be transformed into a rule over the whole of Iran, and in this process the impression that formerly prominent parts of Iran could be ousted was to be avoided. If the members of the Parthian clans were invited by the Sassanids to participate in the building of the new empire, this does not apply to the members of the Arsacid ruling house. Their rule was to be irretrievably over in all parts of the empire. Their rule was supposed to appear as a weak phase of Iran's history, now fortunately overcome. The introduction of the concept of Iran und An-Iran may have also been, and here I quote our host again, an ideological riposte to Rome's view of its empire as an imperium sine fine. The idea of the unity of the empire, or at least of Iran, also becomes apparent in the coin images and legends, as well as in the reliefs, and of course also in the late Sasanian works, such as in the Letter of Tansa, where it features as a significant theme. His Mazdayaznian Majesty Ardashir, King of Kings of Iran, or of the Iranians, whose seed is from the god, places his own royal fire, the only fire that may burn as king's fire, on the reverse of his coins, on whose obverse he appears himself. And on the investiture relief of Naqshi Rustam, the ruling god Ormazd, who defeats the devil Ahriman, presents the ring of rule to Ardashir, victor over the evildoer Ardavan, and the only legitimate aspirant to earthly rule. All this, together with the concrete measures of Shapur I and later on, for example, of Kerdir, the priest, to promote Zoroastrianism, has led many observers to believe that only the Sasanians behaved as pious Zoroastrians, and that the Arsacids, in contrast, put little energy into the religious or Zoroastrian legitimization of their rule. As Albert de Jong has convincingly shown, this impression is deceptive. To convey such an unfavorable picture of the Arsacids was ultimately the intention of Sasanian politico-religious propaganda. By the way, it seems that already Shapur I noticed that Zoroastrianism, as a religious system particularly influential in Iran and bound to the idea of Iran, had only limited potential to create political unity across the whole empire. And on this side of Haran and Urha, there was a great battle with Valerian Caesar, and Valerian Caesar was captured by our own hand, and the rest, the praetorian prefects and the senators and the officers who were the leaders of this army, were all captured and led into Persia. We have already heard that the formation of empires is often enough associated with a trans-territorial claim to power, and that competing empires are often overlooked. This is not true for the Sasanians. As Matthew Canepa and others have very nicely shown, the opponents in the West and East ultimately became almost primordial and paradigmatic opponents in the ideology of Sassanid rule. And I myself have expressed the suspicion that this could have been part of Parthian heritage. In the Res Gestae Divi Saporis and in some of the early triumphal reliefs, the Roman emperor becomes the antagonist par excellence, who is overcome in a duel and portrayed in his role as the defeated or imploring opponent Romano more, in a Roman way, and is thus doubly humiliated. The Sassanids' assumption of power has frequently been equated with the beginning of a more expansive foreign policy, in the sense of an attempt to systematically conquer new territories in the West and East. I am not convinced of this, even though I would hesitate to say that the ideological claims of the early Sasanians ended at the Euphrates or at this side of Bactria. However, in the West, Ardashir and even Shapur were undoubtedly more concerned with winning back and securing the old Parthian territories and eliminating the last Arsacid pockets of resistance, for example in Armenia. In the East, the Sasanians were certainly interested in Bactria early on, but it is unclear when they succeeded in taking over this strategically important territory from the late Kushan rulers. As Wolfgang Havener illustrated, the metus persicus, which is characteristic of the Roman authors of the 3rd century, Cassius Dio and Herodian, is, on the one hand, evidence of Roman uncertainty about the actual war objectives of the Sassanids, and on the other hand, a literary topos, which also sought to make pointed statements about the state of the empire, the Roman Empire, and in particular of the imperial rule in the 3rd century through the construct of a certain image of the Persians. The thesis of a territorial Sasanian emulation of the Achaemenids can still be found in current studies, though. However, the narrative literary structures and intentions of the Roman texts stand in the way of this, as does the fact that Iranian tradition does not know the Achaemenid forerunners or even ancestors of the Sasanians. How is this to be explained in light of the fact that, as Turaj and Rahim have shown, the Jewish and Christian minorities in the Sasanian Empire and even the Sassanids themselves, for example by visiting the synagogue of Dura, must have known Cyrus, ennobled after all with the title of Messiah in the Bible, and other Persian kings. In light of the fact that even the Greek subjects of the Sasanians were probably familiar with Darius, Xerxes, and the Xenophontic Cyrus. While the thesis of a substitution of southwestern Iranian historical traditions by mythical, more prestigious, more religiously colored ones from eastern Iran is quite plausible in a decidedly oral culture, in my view, the question remains why the Sassanids, after their assumption of power, did not look back further than to their immediate predecessors in the reign over Fars, and why it was only later that they referred to the Qais of the whole of Iran in their titulature, albeit the mythical, not the historical ones. The reason for this is probably that the stories of the dynasties of Fars and of the all-Iranian heroes and kings were more promising in terms of legitimation than those of the foreign traditions about forgotten rulers who first would have had to be reintegrated into Iranian contexts. Only the overwhelming success of the Alexander romance in the East in late Sasanian times brought about a change in this respect when, in addition to the positively depicted Alexander, his Iranian half-brother Dara also questioned the political and ideological reference patterns that had hitherto been customary. I'm coming to the end. Should we describe the change of rule from the Arsacids to the Sasanians in the context of a Near Eastern history of empires as break or continuity? The answer depends on our perspective. The Sasanians themselves staged it as a break and continuity at the same time. It was a break in the sense that the weaknesses of Arsacid rule were supposedly left behind, and that Fars was to migrate from the periphery to the center. And it was continuity insofar as their rule was to tie in with the great times of Iranian history. De facto, as well as ideologically, compare the conceptual couple Iran-un-Iran, the new rulers needed the support of all Iranians, not only that of the inhabitants of Fars, not least that of the great Parthian clans, who were therefore guaranteed their position in return for the assurance of loyalty. In order to secure the new rule, however, it was also necessary, at least in the early days, to accept late Parthian conditions and institutions in administration, economy, and social structure. The Roman contemporaries, not least because of the initially unclear aspirations of the Sasanians and the more aggressive appearance of the new lords in relation to the late Arsacids, saw the change of power as a clear break, which Roman authors sought to describe by mentioning the new Artaxerxes' following of the Achaemenid model. The lords of Hatra, who feared a curtailment of their autonomy and switched to the side of Rome, also considered the Sasanians' rise to power a break. If we take a look at the late indigenous tradition, the idea of a break becomes even clearer. Here, the rule of the Arsacids becomes part of the rule of the petty kings. Ardashir opens up a completely new chapter of Iranian history, as it were, and becomes, through his measures, but also his programmatic statements, a model for all his successors. Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you, Josef, for this wonderful talk. Are there any questions, remarks, comments? Please, Jason.
Thank you very much. Do you see the Romans as their interpretation of the Sasanians as being different in some sense from the Parthians? Does that come, when do you pinpoint that shift? Is that something, because you began with the passage of Dio, which is after the initial, my impression of that passage is that's after Ardashir's initial campaign that puts him in a position of power within already within Fars and now in relation to the Parthians. Do you see that already as the moment when the Romans are saying there's something else going on here? And of course you can anticipate this. I'm thinking of that old Tacitus passage where they're already putting the Parthians in the context, or the Parthians already in the context of the Achaemenids.
Yes. Well, Cassius Dio is almost contemporary, I would say. So he's not talking, of course, about the early beginnings of Sasanian rule in Fars, but he's, of course, observing what Ardashir is doing at the border, at the Iranian Roman borders, one might say, and probably people over there and people in Hatra were complaining that those new lords of the East were attacking those borderlines and the border regions and so on. And this gave a new quality to Iranian-Roman relations. So as I cannot remember who brought up this idea, but the Parthians in the last decades before the Sasanians came to power had never tried to shift the borders to the west, I must say. Yeah? So almost only the Romans had tried to get new territories in the east, I might say. But so this was a complete surprise for the Romans that now the enemy in the east was eager to get back lost territories. And this is, but nobody knew in Rome at that moment, or Cassius Dio did not know, what the exact objectives of the Sasanians were at that moment. And Herodian even goes further, no? And he Dio only talks about the aspiration of Ardashir to win back the territories the ancient Persians had been lords of, and Herodian knows exactly the borders of those old territories. He's talking about the Strymon in Macedon and everything like that. So he's familiar, of course, with the Persian wars and Xerxes' campaign to Greece and so on. But this is clearly interpretatio Romana. But I would say both Cassius Dio and Herodian suffer from the same kind of Unwissen, of ignorance, what the real objectives of the Sasanians were that moment. Yeah.
My question is to do with Zoroastrianism and the patronage by the new regime of Zoroastrianism. And it's really, I'm asking you a question because I'm grossly ignorant about Arsacid coinage, but is the appearance of the fire altar on the reverse a Sasanian innovation?
Yeah, but it has a prehistory, one might say, in the coinage of fars before the Sasanians.
Right.
Yeah, so
Right.
this is, as far as I know, really heritage of Persis, I'd say. So this is typical.
Then I'm afraid I've got a. Could
Yeah.
we have the image of the fire altar on the reverse of that early coin of Ardashir, coin type 3? It's absolutely. I mean, I should have been aware of it, but there you've got a fire altar shown in profile, below the fire altar shown head-on at the top, 3 steps leading up to then a sort of slab or something which has got the fire on it. Now, there is a surprise to have the, as it were, the 2 facades of the altar shown on the back of the coin. 2, it is calling, at least to my mind, a structure of steps and then a flat area beyond, which looks like a fire altar, which is perfectly aligned on the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae. So I've never seen a fire altar actually looking like that on the reverse of a coin. So is that a coin type that is taken over from the local coin type before?
Yeah. So no. This is really, so this is interpreted, and I think it is also said in the legend, that this is really Ardashir's fire, and this is the only fire, one might say, which is allowed to burn the whole, during the time of Ardashir's reign, I might say. And it is extinguished when the king dies, and another fire for Shapur, for example, for his son, is lightened up for the new king, and so on. Yeah. So there's only one royal fire, which is really. Yes.
Look, the reason I'm asking is just to give a little bit of sort of oral tradition from a visit to Pasargadae in 1998, when I went with a party of classicists of many sorts, and we were all very, very puzzled about that apparent fire altar, at the back of Beyond, but so carefully. It was I who looked along the line of the horizontal surface to see that it was perfectly aligned on Cyrus's tomb. And at that point, Oswin Murray, who was part of the group, recalled a passage in Plutarch's life of a late Achaemenid king about the inauguration ceremonies in which they were wearing the sheepskin of Cyrus. And then Oswin conjured up for us a picture of a court assembled in the very gentle slope encircling the fire altar. Now, all of this is wild, very, very wild. But the point is, if that is actually the Achaemenid fire altar, which had been there from the distant past, which is connecting the ceremony with the tomb of Cyrus, then your fars, as it were, your fars political, ideological base, you've got both religion and imperial politics. They may not be, as it were, remembering that deep past there, and there's that coin type. So, anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I was told by Ali Moussavi that the excavators in Pasargadae found building activities by the Sasanians in Pasargadae. So Pasargadae was not only an Achaemenid place of veneration and so on, but also it was also inhabited in and used in Sasanian times. But I'm not sure that the Sasanians really knew about the person who had been buried in Cyrus's tomb at that time. I'm quite skeptical about that.
So time is running short. One last short question.
Thank you very much for a very interesting keynote address. I'm just following up on this question of fire which is coming up. You mentioned in the very early stages that there was a fire which was started by Ardishir before fire temple. Was it the first consecration of a fire temple, or were there consecrated fire temples before?
It was, for a long time, it was said that there were no fire temples in Iran before the Sasanian period. And this was so because normally people quoted Herodotus, that there were no buildings in Fars, in Persis, for the veneration of fires, but also for other religious ceremonies and so on. Yeah, so that the Persians only venerated their deities on top of mountains in free nature and so on. And now we know from the Persepolis fortification tablets that there were buildings or sanctuaries for the veneration of deities, also in Achaemenid times, and that we can't trust Herodotus in that respect any longer. So Herodotus is not a real reliable source for the religious affairs in Achaemenid times. Yeah? But what we can say is that the grade of the Zoroastrianized Iranian world was greater in Parthian and Sasanian times than in Achaemenid times.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a good